In the 1970s, a twisted killer was striking at teenage girls on the streets of Manchester.
The police had never seen anything like it before. They said, "We are looking for a monster here."
His methods were brutal.
Repeated blows from a paving stone had shattered her skull.
And bizarre.
The killer had bitten off her nipple and his teeth marks were left on the body.
Those who crossed his path
Even when I was unconscious on the floor, he was still stamping on the head.
recall an inner fury.
He stood there brandishing the knife. He said, "The next time I'll put it across his throat."
In the mid-1970s, the industrial hub of Manchester hit on tough times. As with many areas, the economic downturn took its toll on the close-knit communities to the northeast of the city.
It was very much a working class area, although much of the industry had closed down.
It was fairly rough and ready. Terrace properties with backyards, but all the families knew each other.
It certainly was a hard-working community, but there were elements of criminals amongst that community.
Alan Hart covered the local area as a journalist for over 40 years. But in all that time, one story would unfold that was so disturbing, it would remain with him forever. On the 8th of March 1976, Sharon Mossoff was on a night out. It was a rare opportunity for the 17-year-old, who was the eldest of 5 sisters, had spent much of her teenage years helping out at home.
Because Mum was working, Sharon, because she was the eldest, then started to play Mum. And she did a really, really good job of it. She was really, really so much fun.
She was a really great big sister, you know. She definitely took that role seriously, and she took care of us because she had a very nurturing nature.
We completely respected her because she was just like the whole shebang, you know.
Despite attracting attention from the local boys, the aspiring hairdresser had recently become engaged.
She was a real firecracker, you know, and she was very good looking. But, you know, she picked her horse, you know.
She was quite young, but she was very mature for her age, so it was a natural progression.
On the night in question, Sharon had been to a works night out in Bolton before returning to Manchester. As she was staying with her father in Failsworth, she was unsure of her route home.
She rang her father at around about midnight. She was told by her father what number bus to get, and he expected her home in about half an hour.
Having caught the night bus, the teenager was last seen at a stop just yards from the Rochdale Canal. Her father's house was just a short walk away.
She never did arrive home. There was a big search for her. Her father feared the worst.
The following morning, rookie police cadet 16-year-old Mark Wilkinson received a call to head to the Rochdale Canal.
I think it was the first call we had that particular shift to say that there was the body of a female in the canal. I remember the police officer that I was with said undoubtedly it would be a suicide.
But as they approached, the officer soon realised his initial theory was wide of the mark.
When we arrived here at the canal bank, it was quite obvious it was more than a suicide.
The body was identified as that of the missing girl, 17-year-old Sharon Mossoff.
She was naked, half of her body was above the water level, and it was a particularly cold morning. And I remember quite distinctively that the canal, in fact, had frozen over, so it looked as though she was actually leaning on the ice. I remember looking at this girl who was of a similar age to myself, and just wondering what had actually happened.
As investigators and press arrived on the scene, the cause of death became apparent.
That's the part where she was pulled out, just down there.
Local journalist Alan Hart recalls the appalling aftermath of a brutal attack.
She had been battered and mutilated, and the evidence seemed to be that she'd been strangled with an item of her own clothing.
Further examination of Sharon's body revealed another sordid detail.
It emerged that one of her nipples had been bitten off.
News of the twisted murder shattered the world of the victim's close-knit family.
The police came and said, "Can the children go upstairs?" But then we heard our mother screaming. We came running back downstairs, and then we just seen our mum go into the ground. And it was just unbelievable. And our mother was sedated for days and weeks. It wasn't a good situation. To see our mother, it was awful.
But the horrific mutilation of Sharon's body was not an isolated incident. Police would soon discover a serial killer was operating in the area. "20 years previously, the canal and network of Victorian streets had been the stomping ground for a group of local kids.
We're on Stanley Street, Newton Heath. I used to live in this area when I was younger.
Colin Hardy recalls growing up in a close-knit community.
All the kids knew each other. All the kids played together. It was a good area, a nice area.
But despite his close group of friends, Colin soon realised he stood out from the crowd.
I think I was probably maybe about 8 or 9 when I realised that my family was different from sort of other families.
Peter Melia grew up in Newton Heath alongside the Hardys.
The family themselves were well respected, really. It was just that Trevor Hardy was the black sheep of the family.
The second youngest of 4 children, Trevor's delinquent behaviour had been evident since his early years.
He started off by doing a bit of shoplifting, stealing fruit from vegetable stalls.
He did have a really bad reputation for breaking into houses, breaking into premises. People didn't leave the doors open. If they went out, they made sure the windows were closed. Like my eldest brother was good at plumbing, Trevor was good at burgling houses.
He broke into my own house, or my parents' house, on at least 2 occasions.
The people he burgled, a lot of the time, was known to the family. It's as if he was punishing us.
Colin believes his older brother's vindictive streak was sparked by a change in the family dynamic.
Just after I was born, he committed his first offence at 8 years old. I think somewhere there was some jealousy that he wasn't the youngest anymore. I also think he harboured a grudge against my mum because she'd brought me into the world.
As Trevor entered his teenage years, his behaviour became increasingly unpredictable.
As he got older, his violence started to appear.
He was one of those people that no sooner a word than a blow.
As a boy, Peter Melia found himself the target of an unprovoked attack.
I came up over the canal bridge and just something in the corner of my eye, some movement made me just turn, and he fired this high-powered air rifle straight at me and hit me in the face, between the eyes just there.
Individuals like Hardy enjoy being violent. It's who they are. It's gratifying for them. It's stimulating for them. And it's not to solve a problem, it's to gratify themselves.
As the wayward teenager terrorised the neighbourhood, his father, a British Rail Guard, struggled to cope.
I think my dad was scared of Trevor. In all the years I can remember, my dad never argued with him. He never lifted a finger towards him. But I think my dad would have preferred it if Trevor had just disappeared somehow.
As his behaviour deteriorated, numerous escapes from Borstal and approved schools forced authorities to take drastic action.
He was sent to prison at 15. It's a strange way, it's Manchester prison, the youngest person ever to be sent there.
Although nobody knew it yet, Hardy's early misdemeanours would one day pale into insignificance as he evolved into a very different type of criminal. In March 1976, the city of Manchester was shocked by the brutal murder of local girl Sharon Mossoff. The 17-year-old was strangled and horrifically mutilated before being dumped in a canal in the northeastern suburb of Failsworth. As detectives set to work, they would soon learn that the killer's twisted MO had been witnessed before in a community nearby. Eight months earlier, 18-year-old Wanda Scala had just landed a part-time job in a local pub. Journalist Alan Hart discovered a teenager who was very much at the centre of her neighbourhood.
People knew Wanda and they'd seen her growing up as a little girl. The community was quite a tough working class area, but the people were decent, honest citizens by and large.
People did look out for each other. Poverty often leads to that kind of commitment and close-knit attitude.
On the 19th of July 1975, Wanda finished her pub shift in the early hours of the morning. The short walk home along the main road was a well-trodden route for the teenager. But as her brief journey drew to a close, she suffered a brutal attack.
She was about a minute from her home when her life ended.
The local girl's body was discovered by a passerby the following morning. She had been partially covered by rubble on the edge of a building site.
The police had never seen anything like it before.
A post-mortem revealed that Wanda had been strangled with her own clothes. Her death had also been caused by a series of horrific head injuries.
Repeated blows from a paving stone had shattered her skull. And her socks had been tied around her neck.
But investigators were also shocked to find an even more disturbing aspect to the barbaric act.
At some stage during this violent attack, the killer had bitten off her nipple, and his teeth marks were left on the body.
Biting off women's nipples is the clearest example of ritualistic behavior. His aggressive instinct and his sexual instinct become fused so that the aggressive act is stimulating. Nothing could be more dangerous than an individual with that type of dynamic.
Senior officers who thought they had seen it all were absolutely stunned. They'd never seen anything so brutal. I do recall they said, "We are looking for a monster here."
In them days, murders was something you read about in London, Birmingham. I think it caused a certain amount of fear because, you know, whichever way you look at it, there was a killer on the loose.
Police told women to go out in pairs with boyfriends, brothers, dads. A lot of people were scared. This, after all, wasn't just an ordinary killing. This was the brutal, sadistic murder of a very young woman.
As investigators desperately searched for a lead, neighbouring communities in northeast Manchester continued to live in the shadow of a crime spree. Former delinquent Trevor Hardy had built up his empire over a number of years and had even resorted to recruiting local youngsters off the streets.
He certainly attracted a lot of other young people of my age group in the area. He always seemed to have a few hangers-on.
And I think a lot of them were tea leaves, you know. I think a lot of them were thieves. One policeman did call him Fagin.
For much of the time, the career criminal's personal life had also revolved around the young.
Hardy didn't seem to have any steady girlfriends. He had these friendships with younger children.
During his late 20s, one local teenager had made a particularly strong impression on him.
Beverly was a young girl, about 14, bit of a tomboy. I think Beverly liked the idea of being around Trevor because he had this reputation, and most of the time he always had a few quid on him. And I think with Trevor it boosted his ego, having a young girl.
She said she looked up to him as a father figure. Hardy's version of events became different because he claimed that at some stage they'd been snogging, and Beverly said that this was a figment of his imagination.
As Hardy continued to exert control over the local community, his reputation was increasingly forged through fear.
He was a man to be avoided. He was a man who was totally unpredictable.
He had this reputation as a hard man. And he was. He was handy with his fists. He could walk in a pub and empty it very fast.
Peter Melia grew up in the same neighbourhood as Trevor Hardy. Having had several altercations as a child, he would experience Hardy's violence firsthand on the streets of Newton Heath.
I remember walking along this way, coming from a youth club.
Peter was nearly home when he spotted a suspect character crouched in an adjacent alleyway.
There was a light in the yard behind him. He stood up in the light and I could then see that it was Trevor Hardy. He started to jog down here, so I walked on.
Fearful of Hardy's reputation, Peter headed for the safety of home, but only made it to the front door of a neighbouring pub.
As he approached me, he got about 8 feet away and literally launched himself through the air. He headbutted me in the face and I just felt a really sharp pain in my side. As I got to the corner there was blood in a puddle on the floor near my foot, and I realised at that point that he'd stabbed me. He stood there brandishing the knife, and he said, "The next time I'll put it across your throat."
What drives you to stab somebody? There's got to be something very seriously wrong somewhere.
You know, Hardy doesn't think anything's wrong with him. He sees the world in such a distorted way that he thinks something's wrong with everybody else.
Peter Melia was not the only one to bear the scars of Hardy's fury. As his violence intensified, pub brawls would become the norm. He would be imprisoned following a vicious attack in 1972. Three years later, in October 1975, the neighbouring district of Moston was still reeling from the sadistic killing of 17-year-old Wanda Scala. As police drew up a list of potential suspects, Colin Hardy had received an unwelcome call from his older brother Trevor, summoning him to a local pub.
Well, we hadn't seen each other for months. Well, probably longer than that. A bit apprehensive. I just didn't want to be with him.
Colin had distanced himself from his increasingly unpredictable sibling. Trevor had recently been released from prison when he turned up with his new partner, Sheila.
I think it was probably around about the second pint. It had been idle chit-chat. And just right out of the blue just said to me, "Have you been questioned about the Wanda Scala murder?" So I said, "Well, why should I be questioned about it?" And just as I'm stood here now, he just sat there with no expression on his face and said, "I did it." I did think I'd heard wrong. I said, "You what?" He said, "I did her." My brain just stopped working. I'm thinking, he can't be serious. This Sheila turned around and said, "Colin, it's true." There's not a flicker of emotion in his face. Not a smile, not a frown. My mind just went into overdrive then. If I was scared before, I was petrified now. I wanted to be 1,000 miles away from that room. I wanted to be 1,000 miles away from him. And I just didn't know how to do it. And people might think, well, why didn't you just stand up and shout, "Somebody get the police"? You go into it's like a meltdown.
Struggling to comprehend his brother's extraordinary revelation, a confused Colin eventually allowed Trevor and his girlfriend to accompany him to his flat.
I thought, well, once I get home, you know, everybody thinks you're safe in your own house. But I knew as soon as I walked through the door, I'd made a mistake taking him home.
Colin was about to feel the full wrath of his brother, Trevor Hardy. In July 1975, the mutilated body of teenager Wanda Scala was discovered on a building site in Moston, Manchester. As police searched for the twisted killer, local career criminal Trevor Hardy had just confessed to the brutal killing to his younger brother Colin. Traumatized by the news, he had allowed Trevor and his girlfriend to accompany him home.
By the time the brothers got to Colin's flat, Hardy, by now sobering up, began to regret his decision to tell Colin what had happened.
It wasn't even 10 minutes since we went through the door. And I think I said something like, "Well, look, Trevor, you're going to miss the last bus." And that was it then. He went absolutely berserk. Well, I thought I could handle myself, but I don't even remember the first punch.
Colin's girlfriend could only look on at the sustained and brutal attack that followed.
Even when I was unconscious on the floor, he was still stamping on my head. My partner, she was absolutely petrified. I'm on the floor bleeding unconscious. And he turns round to her and says, "I'm feeling a bit hungry, make me beans on toast." And she was that scared, she went in the kitchen, stepped over me and made him beans on toast. And this woman who he was with, this Sheila, she just sat there and never said a word.
Battered and bruised, Colin regained consciousness later that night. The following day, he reported his brother's confession to the murder of teenager Wanda Scala.
Hardy was arrested and police demanded an imprint of his teeth so that they could compare it to the bite marks on Wanda's breast.
But officers were unaware that Hardy had gone to extreme measures to cover his tracks.
He arranged for somebody to smuggle a nail file to him while he was in custody. He'd filed his teeth so that the bite marks on the body of Wanda Scala would not be matched to him.
To file one's teeth down, which is very, very painful, that's quite unusual. This individual really had an awareness of forensic evidence. So he was intelligent. Unfortunately, he used his intelligence in a very, very deviant way.
The case against Hardy received an irrevocable blow when, out of the blue, his partner insisted he was with her on the night of Wanda's murder.
His newly filed teeth, as well as a false alibi from his girlfriend Sheila, meant police had no option but to let him go.
I couldn't believe it. I said, if you let him go and he effing kills again, I said, be it on your own heads.
Despite his concerns for the local girls in the neighbourhood, Colin was also fearful for his own life.
Well, after that, we turned the flat into a fortress. I put extra bolts on the doors, I put locks, I put wire over the windows, I put broken glass all on the balcony. So basically, we were living in fear.
With his elder brother set on revenge, Colin would suffer another attack. When Trevor only received a suspended sentence, Colin felt the pressure was too much to bear.
I went right off the rails. I got in some trouble and I got jailed.
Although Colin's life had taken a serious downturn, his elder brother Trevor appeared to have turned over a new leaf.
5 months after Wanda's murder, Hardy was branded a local hero in the papers for saving a family from a house fire.
They reported that Hardy, a brave man, had burst into the house and rescued somebody from the fire.
Hardy relished the attention and was pictured beaming in the local papers.
Subsequently, it emerged that Hardy himself had started the fire, not being a hero, but an arsonist.
I don't think he cared as to whether or not people lived or died or the building burned down or whatever. It was just that he could get over on someone. He could manipulate someone. He could fool someone. And he felt good about that.
Trevor Hardy continued to roam the streets of northeast Manchester throughout the early months of 1976. His younger brother Colin was still behind bars when he received some shocking news.
One day, I'd been in the workshops and we'd come back for dinner. And I used to have a paper and right on the front of the Daily Mirror, another girl had been killed, and I knew it was him.
The brutal canal-side murder of 17-year-old Sharon Mossoff bore all the hallmarks of the frenzied attack on Wanda Scala in the nearby district of Moston.
Both Sharon and Wanda had had items of the clothing tied around their necks. They'd both been ferociously beaten, and both had had their nipples bitten off.
There was very little doubt that the person who'd killed Wanda Scala had also killed Sharon Mossoff.
Nobody told us directly, we were children, but we would listen to the grown-ups and we would hear our mother say, apparently he's murdered Wanda Scala. It began to feel very strange to think that this same guy took my sister. So finding that out was really quite strange for me.
As detectives focused their search for a single perpetrator, Colin Hardy could only look on from his cell. Having already failed to bring his brother to justice, Colin felt the latest violent attack was too much to bear.
I've lived with that, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. Always asking, could I have done more?
The police had been up against an elusive adversary, but finally Trevor Hardy was caught in the act. His brutal assault in an Oldham pub on a local woman bore witnesses.
There had been some kind of a dispute between them in the pub, and he'd dragged her into the ladies' toilets, and he'd grabbed her so hard by the throat that she'd bitten her own tongue, and he'd run away when they'd been interrupted.
Hardy evaded capture for a further 2 months, but his final downfall would come at the hand of his now ex-partner, Sheila.
They went to question Sheila at her new flat in Stockport, where she admitted that she'd given a false alibi to the Wanda murder. Police then put Sheila under surveillance, hoping that at some point Hardy would be in touch, and as predicted, he did go to visit her and was promptly arrested in May 1976.
When they told me they'd arrested him, the emotions was unbelievable. There was guilt, there was joy. I just broke down, tears. I just couldn't believe it. My family was now safe.
Hardy was detained in prison, suspected of the murders of local teenagers Wanda Scala and Sharon Mossoff. However, just 3 months later, the prisoner made an extraordinary revelation to the lead detective on the case.
When the officer was called to the prison, he revealed an absolute bombshell. And that was, in addition to Wanda and Sharon, there was a third girl whom he'd killed.
15-year-old Leslie Stewart had been reported missing in the Manchester suburb of Newton Heath 7 months before the murder of Wanda Scala.
In those days, a 15-year-old girl wouldn't necessarily be treated as anything other than a missing person. More likely a runaway, and certainly nothing as sinister as a murder case.
She'd just joined a long list of sad cases of missing teenagers.
Her disappearance on New Year's Eve 1974 had not been linked to the brutal teenage murders that had later plagued the area. On the night in question, Leslie had been dropped off in Newton Heath and was last seen heading to meet her boyfriend at a party.
That's the last time she was seen alive.
Unbeknownst to the 15-year-old, Trevor Hardy had been lurking in the shadows.
Leslie Stewart was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another young girl, alone at night, just like the other two.
As Trevor Hardy's confession unravelled, he insisted that he had mistaken Leslie for former teenage acquaintance Beverly. He claimed that on that night he had been hell-bent on revenge after the young girl had severed ties with him during his recent spell in prison.
As Leslie got out of the car that was dropping her off, the driver said, "Good night, Leslie." But tragically for her, Trevor Hardy thought he heard the word Beverly.
So he shouted, "Hey, Beverly." When she turned round, he stabbed her in the throat.
After watching Leslie bleed to death, Hardy dragged her to a secluded spot where he dug a shallow grave, then walked to his parents' house where he watched a Hogmanay TV show with his mother.
But Hardy's gruesome account didn't end there. He insisted on taking police to the scene of the horrific murder in Newton Heath.
If memory serves, it's pretty much where the net is, round about there that her body was found.
Although almost 2 years had passed, the 30-year-old gave a detailed account of his attempts to conceal Leslie's body.
He claimed that in the first instance, he'd not buried it very deeply. And so after a few days, he came back, buried it a little further.
But Hardy hadn't just been intent on covering his tracks. Detectives were about to learn the full extent of the killer's depravity. In 1976, Trevor Hardy was facing charges for the murders of 2 teenage girls in northeast Manchester. But in an extraordinary twist, the local man had also confessed to the earlier killing of missing 15-year-old Leslie Stewart, taking police to the murder site in Newton Heath. Having located a shallow grave, investigators were horrified to discover that the corpse was not complete.
He'd mutilated her body, cutting Leslie's head off. He buried it somewhere else. Then he came back again, cut her feet off, and buried the feet somewhere else nearby.
All this was in view of a local school, and he had boasted that the kids had seen him dismembering the parts and playing with them and burying them without knowing what he was up to.
He even took a ring off her finger and gave it to his girlfriend as a love token.
What kind of a person goes back to a body and does what he did?
There was something with that victim that really grabbed him. He was certainly attached to that victim in a way that he wasn't attached to others. He kept going back to relive the experience, to further mutilate the body, and to do other things with the body to continue the gratification.
That is a killer who enjoyed killing.
In April 1977, Trevor Hardy was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murders of Leslie Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mossoff.
Subsequently, he was told life would mean life and that he would have to stay in prison for the rest of his life.
In the wake of Hardy's reign of terror, many struggled to comprehend why he had targeted the young teenagers. Although the profile of his victims bore marked similarities, Hardy maintained that 2 of the attacks were purely random.
I've never believed any of the excuses he's given. Wanda Scala, a mugging that went wrong. I don't believe that for 1 minute. Why mutilate the body? No, he enjoyed it.
These individuals feel very weak inside. They feel very inadequate inside. And so it's not at all uncommon for them to target children, young adolescents. until they gain some degree of comfort in killing, and then they might attack someone who might show some level of resistance.
But was the twisted violence dealt by this sadistic killer the inevitable result of a troubled life? Or was Trevor Hardy born to kill?
Lots and lots of people had similar upbringings to Trevor Hardy, and they didn't go off the rails in the way that he did. He is one of these people who is just pure evil.
My friend who lived on his street said he would kill animals and everything when he was a kid. He was just a very sadistic person.
Considering how many murders he did and how much violence was in his life, I definitely think that he was born to just be a killer.
He was supposed to have had some kind of an accident when he was young, and it involved his skull. And there was a splinter of bone, and when he got excited, this bone pressed on the brain.
I don't like to say someone was born to kill, but he certainly had a predisposition for violence. And head injury can weaken someone's inhibitory controls and make it much easier for someone to act out their impulses or what's going on internally.
For many, the horror of this brutal killer has faded away. But some will never forget.
I was just unfortunate enough to have him as a brother, and it'll never go away. You get up day after day and you just get on with your life. I decided to take part in this programme because I wanted my chance to tell my side of things. I have not asked for any payment. I would not insult the victims' families by asking for payment.
And for those who lost their lives, their memory will always remain.
We don't shy away from talking about Sharon because she was our big sister and she was a big part of our lives.
She's just remembered as a really, really, really fun, fantastic, nurturing, loving big sister. She's missed every day. She's missed every single day. There's not a day goes by that we don't think about her.
The night California forgot her name began with a sound no one could place, a single sharp echo cutting through the dark, then silence so complete it felt staged, rehearsed, deliberate, the kind of silence that makes witnesses question their own memories. It was the spring of 1996, a year still clinging to payphones and paper maps, a year when DNA was whispered about like a miracle but trusted like a rumor, and somewhere between a quiet residential street and the edge of a drainage canal, a young woman vanished from the record of ordinary life and slipped straight into the language of headlines: missing, last seen, no suspects, cold case waiting to happen. Her car was found first, parked crookedly as if abandoned in a hurry, driver's door ajar, keys still in the ignition, the radio frozen on a late-night talk show, the kind meant to keep insomniacs company. The interior smelled faintly of perfume and dust. No blood. No sign of a struggle anyone could agree on. Just a purse on the passenger seat, wallet inside, cash untouched, identification smiling back at officers who already sensed this would not be a simple report filed and closed by morning. The neighborhood stood awake behind curtains, faces pressed to glass, community rehearsing shock in real time. By sunrise, Yellow tape cut the street into clean geometric shapes, and the word, cold case, had not yet been spoken, but it hovered nearby, waiting. Detectives moved carefully, photographing tire marks that might mean nothing, footprints that blurred into each other, a cigarette butt crushed into gravel near the curb. Evidence bags filled with possibility. Not answers. Never answers. The victim's name traveled fast, radio, television, photocopied flyers stapled to telephone poles. She was described in warm, careful terms, reliable, friendly, punctual, the kind of person who called if she was running late. The kind of person who did not disappear. They traced her last hours backward, frame by frame, like rewinding damaged tape. A gas station receipt time-stamped just after midnight. A clerk who remembered a polite smile, nothing more. A phone call placed from a friend's house earlier that evening, casual, unremarkable, deadly in hindsight. Witnesses stepped forward with fragments, a dark sedan idling too long, footsteps on gravel, a voice raised, not screaming, just firm, controlled, the kind that could belong to anyone. Each statement added shape without substance, an outline without a body. Search teams combed the canal banks, the fields beyond the subdivision, the half-forgotten industrial lots where weeds grew taller than reason. Helicopters thumped overhead, stirring dust and hope in equal measure. Dogs traced scents that led nowhere, stopped abruptly, circled back on themselves. Volunteers arrived with bottled water and prayers, forming human chains that broke apart as days stretched into nights. Cameras captured tears, clenched jaws, hands folded too tightly. The community learned the weight of waiting. Inside the task force office, walls filled with maps and timelines, photos pinned with red and blue markers, threads of logic stretching thin. Detectives argued quietly over coffee gone cold. Was this a crime of opportunity or familiarity? A stranger or someone close? A sudden eruption of violence or a plan executed with calm efficiency? Every theory had teeth. None could bite. The victim's routine was dissected until nothing felt normal anymore. Routes she drove every day now looked dangerous. Places she trusted felt exposed. Then came the first false lead, loud and promising. A tip called in by a man who claimed to know something, who enjoyed the attention just enough to overplay his hand. He was questioned, released, forgotten, his name lingering on the board longer than it deserved. Another lead followed, then another, each one flaring briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. The word, cold, crept closer, whispered in hallways, printed cautiously in internal memos. Unsolved cases began to stack up, and this one slid quietly into the pile, still warm, still raw, but already losing priority to fresher blood. Months passed. Seasons changed. Rain washed away what the sun hadn't erased. The victim's family aged in public, their grief a slow-motion spectacle that news crews returned to on anniversaries and slow news days. Candlelight vigils flickered, melted, were packed away until next year. The investigation narrowed not because answers were found, but because options ran out. Evidence was boxed, labeled, shelved. A single biological sample, too small, too degraded, was logged with cautious optimism, then filed under insufficient for comparison. Science, it seemed, was not ready to listen yet. By the end of 1996, the case had a number, a file, and a future no one wanted to name. Detectives rotated off. New faces skimmed old notes, tracing someone else's handwriting, trying to hear urgency through ink. The story hardened into something inert, retold with fewer details each time. A missing woman became a statistic. A community learned to live around the absence, building routines that stepped carefully over an unmarked grave of uncertainty. Years later, when the phrase, cold case, was finally spoken aloud, it landed with a dull inevitability. The file was officially reassigned, officially unsolved, officially waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for memory to crack. Waiting for someone, somewhere, to make a mistake. In the meantime, the victim existed in fragments, a photograph with outdated hair, a voice preserved on an answering machine, a bedroom left mostly untouched because moving anything felt like admitting something final. Detectives who remembered the early days spoke about it with a particular tension in their voices, a mix of frustration and unfinished business. They talked about the cigarette butt, the tire marks, the canal. They talked about how close it felt, how it always feels close before it's gone. They talked about suspects who almost fit, about alibis that held just long enough, about gut feelings unsupported by proof. The case became a lesson taught to rookies. This is how things slip away. And then, quietly, without ceremony, the future arrived. Not with a confession or a witness, but with a lab update years in the making. A new process. A refined technique. Old evidence, re-examined under unforgiving light. The biological sample, once dismissed, was tested again, coaxed into speaking. A partial profile emerged, thin but distinct, a genetic whisper that did not name a person but promised one existed. The case stirred in its box. The word, cold, began to thaw. The profile was entered into databases that hadn't existed in 1996, systems built on the accumulation of other crimes, other mistakes, other nights that ended badly. For a long time, there was nothing. Then a near miss. Then silence again. Investigators learned patience the hard way. They checked. They waited. They checked again. Every refresh carried the same quiet hope, the same restrained breath. Somewhere, a man lived an ordinary life, unaware or unwilling to be aware of how close the past hovered. He paid bills. He aged. He blended into the background noise of the state. The community where the crime occurred moved on, but the case did not forget. It lingered, dormant, coiled, waiting for the smallest trigger. By the time the database finally spoke back, the shock was not in the name it produced, but in the distance it collapsed. Decades folded into a single moment. A match. Not a full confession. Not closure. Just a door creaking open at last. Investigators stared at the screen, recalibrating everything they thought they knew. The past had reached forward and grabbed the present by the throat. But for now, back in 1996, none of that was visible. All anyone could see was an empty car, a quiet street, and a question that refused to be answered. A woman gone. A city uneasy. A case cooling by degrees. The kind of story that doesn't end when the cameras leave, that doesn't stop breathing just because the headlines do. The kind that waits, patiently, for the moment when science catches up with silence, and the truth decides it's ready to be heard. Time did what it always does to unanswered questions. It stretched them thin, pulled them across years until they became part of the background, a low hum beneath everyday life. The case didn't vanish, it settled. It learned how to sleep. In the late 90s, the file was reopened just long enough to remind everyone why it had been closed, a new detective tracing old steps, knocking on doors that had already learned how to stay shut. Memories had softened. Witnesses contradicted themselves without meaning to. Details that once felt sharp now slid out of reach, rounded off by repetition and fatigue. Every interview ended the same way, with apologies and shrugs and the quiet shame of not being able to help. The neighborhood had changed. Houses repainted. Families moved in, moved out. Children who had been warned not to talk to strangers were now adults with keys of their own. The street where the car was found no longer felt dangerous, just ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like an insult to what had happened there. Detectives stood in the same spot years later, trying to imagine the night again, the angle of the headlights, the way fear might have moved through the air, but imagination was a poor substitute for evidence. Inside the evidence room, cardboard boxes waited in orderly rows, each one holding a version of the past that could no longer defend itself. The cigarette butt was still there, sealed, labeled, its promise intact but dormant. Fibers lifted from the car's upholstery. A smudge on the door handle that might have been nothing, might have been everything. In 1996, the science had drawn a line and stopped. Now the line shifted, cautiously, year by year. Techniques improved. Standards tightened. What was once noise could now be signal. But budgets had limits, and cold cases competed with the living for attention. The victim's family learned a new vocabulary over time. No updates. Still pending. We haven't forgotten. Phrases designed to comfort without committing. They marked birthdays without her, holidays rearranged around absence. Hope became something quieter, more disciplined. They stopped asking when and started asking if. In interviews, they spoke carefully, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of saying nothing at all. Their grief aged, deepened, became less visible but no less heavy. Rumors surfaced the way they always do when facts refuse to cooperate. A drifter seen nearby. A former boyfriend with a temper. A co-worker who asked too many questions. Names were passed around at backyard barbecues, in break rooms, online forums that sprouted in the early days of the internet. Amateur detectives built theories from fragments, connecting dots that professionals couldn't legally touch. Some of them were close. None of them were right in the ways that mattered. By the early 2000s, the case had been digitized, reduced to scanned documents and compressed photographs, its physical weight replaced by data. This made it easier to access and harder to feel. Detectives scrolling through screens missed the tactile reminder of paper, the way a thick file demanded attention by sheer mass. Still, they looked. They always looked. Late nights. Quiet offices. The glow of monitors reflecting off tired faces. They revisited timelines, recalculated travel distances, questioned assumptions that had hardened into fact simply because no one had challenged them. One assumption in particular refused to sit still, that the perpetrator was local. It made sense at the time. Familiarity with the area. Comfort operating unnoticed. But comfort can be learned, and highways collapse distance in ways that maps don't capture. The idea widened the search and diluted it at the same time. Every unknown face became possible. Every possibility became unlikely. The case expanded until it was too large to hold. Then there was the DNA, still incomplete, still stubborn. A partial profile is a tease, a silhouette without features. It can exclude more easily than it can accuse. Over the years, it cleared suspects who had lived under quiet suspicion, men who had felt the weight of sideways glances and sudden silence when they entered a room. Some of them expressed relief. Others expressed anger. None of them offered answers. The profile sat in the system, patient, waiting for its counterpart to appear. Meanwhile, the world learned to trust genetics in a way it hadn't before. High-profile cases fell open under its gaze. Old crimes confessed under the pressure of inevitability. The public narrative shifted. DNA became the hero of the story, the impartial witness that never forgot. Investigators felt both hope and restraint. They knew its power. They also knew its limits. Contamination. Coincidence. The danger of believing too completely. The case crossed desks, crossed decades. It became a reference point. Remember that one, used to illustrate how easily things could go wrong, how quickly opportunity could outrun preparation. New detectives inherited it like a family story, something told with reverence and frustration. They promised themselves they would be the ones to crack it, the ones to call the family with something more than sympathy. They meant it. They always meant it. A break came quietly, the way most real breaks do, not with sirens or headlines but with an email forwarded twice, a lab technician flagging a result that didn't fit before but now demanded attention. The partial profile had been refined again, its edges sharpened by advances no one in 1996 could have predicted. It was still partial. Still fragile. But it was enough to try something new. A different database. A different approach. The kind that worked sideways instead of straight on. Investigative genetic genealogy was still controversial, still treated with caution, but it offered a path where none existed. Not a name. Not yet. Just a family tree sketched in probabilities and shared markers. Cousins. Second cousins. A web of relations stretching outward, backward. Analysts worked slowly, aware that one mistake could poison everything. They built the tree branch by branch, pruning impossibilities, circling clusters that pointed back to California in the mid-90s. The process took months, then years. It survived budget reviews, leadership changes, moments where it almost died on a conference table under the weight of skepticism. But it persisted. Each small confirmation fed the next step. A census record here. A marriage license there. A move that aligned with the timeline. The past began to feel crowded again, populated with names that had never been on the board before. At the center of one cluster was a man who had never been interviewed, never been considered. He had lived quietly, worked steadily, avoided attention with the ease of someone who never expected it. In 1996, he would have been forgettable. In 2006, invisible. In 2016, he was a data point. Investigators didn't rush. They knew better. They watched. They verified. They let the facts build their own gravity. When they finally put his name on the board, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like risk. Everything hinged on what came next, on whether the science that had brought them this far could finish the job without falling apart under scrutiny. Surveillance began, subtle and legal, the slow accumulation of discarded items and public movements. Coffee cups. Napkins. A cigarette tossed without thought. The ordinary debris of a life lived unafraid. Back in the lab, comparisons were made with hands that understood the stakes. A match would mean reopening wounds that had learned to scar over. A non-match would mean explaining to everyone why years of work led nowhere again. The weight tightened. Investigators slept poorly. The past pressed in. And somewhere between the first and second confirmation, the case crossed an invisible line. It was no longer just a memory, no longer just a lesson. It was active again, breathing, dangerous. The cold case had heat now, enough to burn anyone standing too close. All that remained was the question that had haunted it from the beginning, sharpened by time instead of dulled. When the truth finally spoke, would it be enough? The confirmation didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, incremental, almost polite, as if the science itself understood the weight of what it was about to say. The first comparison narrowed the field. The second reduced it further. Analysts spoke in careful language, probabilities stacked on probabilities, margins shrinking until coincidence became an insult to reason. In the lab, screens glowed with numbers that meant nothing to the outside world and everything to the people trained to read them. This was no longer a theory built on hunches or half-remembered faces. This was math. This was inheritance. This was the past leaving fingerprints it couldn't wipe away. Investigators met behind closed doors, voices low, restrained by habit and fear of jinxing something fragile. The suspect's name was said sparingly, never above a murmur, as if volume alone could send him running. They laid out his timeline with ruthless precision. Where he lived in 1996. Where he worked. How far his commute stretched. Which routes overlapped with the victim's last known movements. Ordinary facts took on a new menace when aligned just right. The map on the wall grew crowded again, pins reappearing after years of absence. He had no criminal record worth noting. No obvious history of violence. Friends described him as quiet, reliable, the kind of man you forget is in the room until he leaves. Employers called him steady. Neighbors waved without learning his name. This absence of noise had protected him for decades. It was also what made investigators nervous. People like this didn't crack under pressure. They didn't confess for the drama of it. If this was the right man, the truth would have to be taken, not offered. Surveillance intensified, measured and invisible. Teams rotated to avoid patterns. Vehicles blended into traffic. Notes were taken on habits so mundane they felt absurd to record: morning coffee stops, preferred brands, the rhythm of his workday. He smoked occasionally, not out of addiction but convenience, a detail logged with professional detachment and quiet anticipation. The discarded end of a cigarette was no longer trash. It was a potential voice. The collection happened without ceremony. A napkin from a cafe table. A cup from a public trash bin. Each item was sealed like a promise and rushed back to the lab, where sterile rooms waited to decide whether decades of waiting had led to this moment or another dead end. Analysts worked through the night, careful not to rush, aware that one contaminated sample could collapse the entire case. Outside, the city slept, unaware that its past was being interrogated under fluorescent lights. When the results came in, they didn't explode. They settled. The match wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to justify the next step, strong enough to change the tone of every conversation in the room. Detectives exhaled, some of them for the first time in years. The case had crossed from possibility into action. The word cold no longer applied. This was live ammunition. A warrant was prepared with language sharpened by scrutiny. Every claim backed by documentation. Every leap bridged by data. Prosecutors were cautious, their skepticism honed by years of cases that fell apart in courtrooms instead of alleys. They asked hard questions. They demanded redundancy. They planned for defense strategies that hadn't yet been written. This wasn't just about being right. It was about surviving what came after. The arrest came early, time to catch the suspect between routines, before the day could rearrange itself around resistance. He answered the door himself, surprised but composed, eyes flicking briefly to the badges before settling into something unreadable. He didn't run. He didn't ask why. He listened, nodded once, and stepped aside as if he had been expecting this moment in some abstract way all along. The neighborhood watched from porches and windows, the same choreography of curiosity and fear replayed decades later with new faces. At the station, the interview room felt smaller than usual, its walls heavy with anticipation. The suspect sat upright, hands folded, posture careful. Detectives introduced themselves, laid out the reason for the conversation with deliberate neutrality. They talked about 1996 without emotion, reciting facts like coordinates, watching for tremors that never came. He denied nothing directly. He offered explanations that circled without landing. He asked questions that revealed nothing. Hours passed. The air grew stale. When confronted with the DNA, his expression changed, not dramatically, not in the way movies promise, but subtly, like someone realizing the rules of a game have shifted without warning. He leaned back, exhaled, considered. He didn't confess. He didn't collapse. He asked for a lawyer, and the room went quiet in a way that felt final. The interview ended with the soft click of a recorder turning off, a sound that echoed longer than it should have. News broke fast, faster than anyone expected. Headlines raced ahead of facts, compressing years into lines that promised resolution. Cold case solved. DNA leads to arrest. Community stunned. Cameras returned to the street where the car had been found, now lined with satellite trucks and microphones eager for closure. Reporters spoke of justice like it was a destination already reached. The family was notified before the press, but only just. Their reactions were careful, restrained, shaped by experience. They had been here before, in smaller ways. Hope had learned to whisper. In court filings, the language hardened. Probabilities became assertions. Partial profiles were framed as near certainties. The defense pushed back immediately, attacking the science, the databases, the ethics of genealogical searching. They questioned contamination. They questioned bias. They questioned whether the past had been shaped to fit the present rather than the other way around. The courtroom became a battlefield where certainty was measured in decimals and doubt was amplified by repetition. As the case moved forward, cracks began to show, not in the DNA itself but in the story built around it. Timelines overlapped imperfectly. A work record placed the suspect miles away during a narrow window investigators had treated as fixed. A witness statement from 1996, long dismissed, resurfaced with inconvenient clarity. The cigarette butt, once a linchpin, raised questions about secondary transfer no one wanted to answer out loud. The more closely the case was examined, the less cinematic it became. Experts testified with calm authority and careful disclaimers. They explained how matches work, how they don't, how probability can feel like certainty to those desperate for it. Jurors listened, eyes flicking between charts and faces, trying to reconcile the promise of science with the messiness of human behavior. Outside, public opinion hardened and fractured in equal measure. Some saw the arrest as overdue justice. Others sensed something unfinished beneath the noise. The family watched from the gallery, absorbing every word like it mattered more than oxygen. For them, this wasn't a debate about methods or margins. It was the possibility of an ending, something they had lived without for so long it felt dangerous to imagine. They wanted the truth, whatever shape it took. They also wanted it to hold. Behind the scenes, investigators felt the pressure shift. Solving a cold case brings applause. Questioning its solution brings silence. They reviewed their own work with increasing unease, replaying decisions, rechecking assumptions. Had they wanted it too badly? Had the years sharpened their focus or narrowed it? The suspect remained calm, his demeanor unchanged by headlines or hearings, as if the chaos belonged to someone else. As the trial approached, motions piled up. Evidence was challenged, limited, reframed. The partial nature of the DNA loomed larger now, its imperfections magnified by scrutiny. The prosecution adjusted, emphasizing patterns, behavior, opportunity. The defense leaned into doubt, reminding everyone that absence of explanation is not proof of guilt. The case balanced on a thin edge, history pressing down on one side, science pushing up on the other. And in the quiet moments between hearings, when the cameras packed up and the courtroom emptied, the question returned, persistent and unwelcome. What if this wasn't the end? What if the answer everyone wanted was only adjacent to the truth, close enough to touch but not to hold? The cold case had been disturbed, its surface broken, but whether it had truly been solved remained uncertain, hanging in the air like a verdict no one was ready to read aloud. The city that had once slept through the disappearance now pulsed with a tension it had long avoided. Streets once quiet under the weight of normal life became corridors of speculation. Reporters huddled over notebooks, capturing fragments of community memory, reconstructing a narrative decades in the making. Each retelling added layers, details exaggerated, recollections sharpened or softened by emotion. What had been ordinary in 1996 now seemed ominous, almost theatrical, as if the absence itself had rewritten reality. The house where she had lived, untouched for years by anyone but her family, suddenly felt like a stage. Curtains drawn, lights low, shadows stretching along walls like fingers, memories echoing in rooms no one could enter without hesitation. Neighbors spoke quietly among themselves, their voices hushed as though saying her name aloud might conjure something unwelcome. They remembered the night her car was found, the yellow tape slicing the street, the tension that rolled through the neighborhood like a storm cloud. Some remembered details differently than others, discrepancies that fueled the sense of mystery, a man seen lurking in a doorway, headlights flashing against brick, a dog barking for hours into the night. Each version coexisted with others, competing for credibility, none of them verifiable beyond the fragile structures of memory. Detectives revisited the same places over and over, the streets unchanged but the atmosphere transformed by years and by the knowledge that the suspect was real, tangible, present. They walked the route she might have taken, noting intersections, blind corners, abandoned lots. They spoke in clipped sentences about points of opportunity, lines of sight, windows of vulnerability. Each term was clinical, designed to remove emotion from observation, yet even their precise language could not suppress the feeling that history was pressing down, that these streets remembered more than anyone cared to admit. Inside the station, the evidence room became a shrine to perseverance. Boxes of photographs yellowed at the edges, files stacked with meticulous care, fingerprints catalogued with obsessive precision. The cigarette butt, once insignificant, now represented a thread connecting the past to the present. Fibers lifted from upholstery, smudges of blood long degraded, a partial DNA profile, all dormant until the right tools could coax them into relevance. Technicians worked under fluorescent lights, their faces taut with concentration, translating decades-old remnants into new lines of inquiry. The suspect's life, unremarkable until now, began to be scrutinized without mercy. Employment records, utility bills, cell phone activity from a time before smartphones, bank deposits, even casual social interactions, every pattern mapped, every anomaly noted. Investigators searched for inconsistencies, contradictions, habits that might reveal more than the suspect wanted to admit. He remained composed, moving through routine with mechanical care, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the web tightening around him. Family members of the victim oscillated between hope and fear. Every update brought relief, then hesitation. Could it really be him? Could this finally close the wound that had been kept open by time and uncertainty? They spoke carefully in interviews, measured in tone, guarding the intensity of their reactions. The media scrutinized each gesture, reading sorrow, anger, and expectation like a collective Rorschach test. Social commentary emerged alongside factual reporting, opinions forming a chorus that both illuminated and distorted the underlying truth. Court preparations intensified. Prosecutors combed through evidence, reconciling decades-old reports with the new forensic findings. Defense attorneys sought to dismantle credibility, targeting methods, databases, and the very principle of genealogical investigation. Each side fortified its position, anticipating challenges, building contingencies. The legal dance began long before the gavel fell, negotiations and objections forming a rhythm as intricate as it was relentless. Meanwhile, the partial DNA profile that had first opened the investigation became the centerpiece. Analysts described its strengths and limitations with careful attention to probabilities, emphasizing what it could show and what it could not. Lines of inheritance were drawn, markers compared, family trees extended with meticulous logic. Every potential connection examined, every probability verified multiple times. The science was powerful but not infallible, and everyone involved knew it. One misstep could unravel decades of effort. As the trial date approached, the suspect maintained a calm, almost eerie composure. He did not panic, did not overreact, did not make mistakes that investigators had long anticipated. He answered questions with precision, never volunteering information, never confirming or denying what could not be proven. In quiet moments, detectives speculated about his psychology, patient, calculating, aware. Perhaps the most dangerous of all, they considered, are those who remain invisible precisely because they know how to be. Community sentiment fluctuated. Some celebrated the promise of closure, believing justice was finally within reach. Others expressed unease, skeptical that a partial match, decades removed from the crime, could truly account for the enormity of the past. Public discussions debated morality, legality, and the reliability of modern science. Online forums dissected the case, hypothesized motives, and scrutinized every release of information, turning uncertainty into communal obsession. Investigators continued to trace every thread, revisiting timelines, checking alibis, following leads that emerged from new interpretations of old evidence. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances, seeking small details that might corroborate the larger narrative. Each conversation added nuance, sometimes contradicting prior assumptions, revealing the fragility of memory and the unpredictability of human perception. At night, offices emptied but the case did not rest. Analysts ran tests, technicians rechecked samples, and detectives pored over maps and spreadsheets. The glow of computer screens reflected off exhausted faces, silent witnesses to years of pursuit. The case had shifted from static to active, from cold to charged, filled with potential and peril in equal measure. And yet, despite the intensity, the truth remained elusive. The suspect's actions in 1996 could not be observed directly. Every reconstruction relied on fragments, probabilities, and interpretation. There was no video, no eyewitness testimony strong enough to close the loop entirely. The case hung between science and story, law and logic, fact and interpretation. The tension in the air was palpable. Every meeting, every lab result, every strategy session carried the weight of decades, the expectation of resolution, and the ever-present possibility of disappointment. The past and present collided, creating a pressure cooker of anticipation. The cold case had reawakened, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living, breathing investigation that demanded answers before it could rest again. Each day moved the case forward, but forward did not guarantee certainty. The community, the family, the investigators, all participants in an intricate choreography of patience, scrutiny, and hope, waited for the moment when the partial whispers of science could finally translate into undeniable truth. And until that moment arrived, the shadows of 1996 remained, stretching across the streets, the houses, and the memories of everyone who had ever known a world where a young woman vanished and the city held its breath in her absence. The morning air carried a quiet tension that could be felt in every corner of the city, the kind of tension that had been accumulating for decades without anyone noticing. Streets that had once been ordinary now felt lined with possibility and threat simultaneously. Every pedestrian, every passing car, every dog barking in the distance seemed to participate unwittingly in a narrative long written but only now being deciphered. Detectives walked these streets again, notebooks in hand, eyes scanning angles, corners, and shadows as if the environment itself could confess what humans had withheld. They replayed 1996 in their minds, step by step, note by note, searching for the invisible thread that could finally link past and present with absolute certainty. Inside the station, the atmosphere was taut. Analysts bent over screens, re-examining fibers, traces, and markings collected decades prior, coaxing out what the science of 1996 could not reveal. Each sample told a story, partial, fractured, but insistent. A cigarette butt, once overlooked, now contained a whisper of truth, while smudges on a door handle gained significance under the scrutiny of modern technology. Every new reading seemed to inch closer to clarity, yet the shadow of doubt lingered, reminding all involved that for every answer gained, more questions might emerge. The suspect remained elusive in his ordinariness, his life a carefully constructed routine that masked the extraordinary weight of suspicion closing around him. Detectives monitored his movements, recording mundane details, morning coffee stops, shopping patterns, casual conversations, mapping patterns that could support or disprove the evolving narrative of guilt. Each observation was dissected and catalogued, weighed against timelines and DNA probabilities, while the suspect, unaware or indifferent, continued through the motions of a life seemingly untouched by decades-old shadows. Meanwhile, the victim's family oscillated between hope and dread, knowing too well that decades of waiting could make closure both a balm and a torment. Media crews arrived, cameras trained on familiar streets and once-forgotten houses, presenting headlines promising resolution, cold case solved, DNA leads to arrest, justice decades overdue. Each broadcast brought the family to a delicate balance of relief and caution, aware that the narrative presented to the world might not align with the reality contained within sealed evidence bags and lab reports. Their grief had aged, grown intricate with the patience of time, each anniversary marked not just by remembrance but by the complex anticipation of finally understanding what had happened. Legal preparation intensified, a battleground of meticulous precision. Prosecutors, aware of the partial nature of the DNA evidence, fortified every claim with timelines, photographs, and corroborating witness statements. Defense attorneys attacked the reliability of genealogical methods, the chain of custody, and the very principle of inferring guilt from probability. Courtroom strategies unfolded as a careful dance, each motion, objection, and filing calculated to sway the scales between interpretation and truth. The partial DNA match, the centerpiece of the case, became a symbol of the precariousness of certainty, both a breakthrough and a potential trap. Investigators retraced routes, re-interviewed old acquaintances, and mapped every plausible scenario, aware that decades had eroded memories, distorted perceptions, and, in some cases, allowed deception to root itself unnoticed. They scrutinized inconsistencies, a work schedule that might contradict an earlier timeline, minor discrepancies in past witness accounts, subtle differences in neighborhood recollections. The process was exhaustive, a web of cross-checking and verification designed to anticipate defense challenges before they could be formally presented. The suspect's demeanor remained composed, unnervingly calm in the face of scrutiny. He cooperated within legal bounds but revealed nothing voluntarily, his demeanor a mirror of patience and control that amplified the unease in every observer. Experts speculated that his composure was deliberate, a carefully honed defense mechanism, or perhaps simply the nature of a person who had lived unnoticed for decades, protected by the very ordinariness that had once rendered him invisible. Community response was complex. Some welcomed the potential for closure with open arms, ready to reclaim the narrative that had haunted the streets for so long. Others hesitated, skeptical of the methods and concerned about the implications of relying on genetic inference and modern forensic reconstruction. Discussions proliferated online and in homes, debates over morality, accuracy, and the meaning of justice layering over decades-old grief and communal memory. Each opinion influenced perception, demonstrating how the resonance of unresolved crime extends far beyond the immediate circle of victims and investigators. At night, offices remained illuminated, screens glowing, analysts and detectives working in concert, a silent orchestra orchestrated by data, probability, and painstaking human judgment. Every detail, fiber alignment, genetic marker, historical timeline, was examined with methodical intensity. The partial DNA profile, once a whisper, had gained a voice, yet that voice spoke only in probabilities, requiring careful interpretation before conclusions could be drawn. Mistakes could unravel years of work, precision was the only safeguard against collapse. The investigation increasingly relied on triangulating minutiae, discarded items, social patterns, logistical possibilities. Analysts constructed probable routes, timelines, and sequences of behavior, layering each with the certainty science could provide and the uncertainty that life guarantees. Small details, a newspaper left at a coffee shop, a bus route traveled, an inconsequential conversation overheard, took on magnified significance, each a potential pivot between accusation and exoneration. As trial preparations advanced, investigators and attorneys alike understood that decades of elapsed time had transformed both evidence and perception. Memory was malleable, witnesses had aged, and context had shifted. Legal arguments would hinge as much on interpretation of old data as on new science. The cold case was no longer a historical artifact, it had become a live entity, dynamic and demanding, with stakes that included not just potential conviction but the preservation of scientific credibility and the integrity of justice itself. The community watched, rapt, as layers of decades-old events and modern investigation intertwined. Streets, homes, and offices that had been ordinary became theaters of anticipation and scrutiny. Media coverage ensured that every development was broadcast, every possibility discussed, and every reaction magnified. The story had become larger than itself, an echo of unresolved tension that connected past and present, grief and hope, probability and certainty. And through it all, the case retained its central, unnerving truth: the past was inescapable. Despite the passage of time, despite shifts in technology and society, despite the calm composure of the suspect, every piece of evidence, every observation, every recollection remained tethered to the moment when a young woman disappeared, leaving an absence that had defined decades. The cold case had thawed into motion, alive with anticipation, yet the ultimate resolution remained uncertain, hovering just beyond reach, demanding patience, precision, and the careful negotiation of both science and human fallibility. The tension surrounding the case thickened as investigators pieced together a narrative that decades of silence had refused to yield. Each fragment of evidence, once dormant, began to vibrate with significance. The victim's final movements were reconstructed with painstaking detail, cross-referencing surveillance footage, old photographs, and witness recollections, some vivid, some contradictory, all subject to the distortion of time. Investigators stood in the streets she once walked, imagining her path, noting each possible interaction, each shadow that might have concealed the moment everything changed. Every detail, every ordinary element, now carried the weight of potential revelation. Inside the lab, analysts worked through nights lit by the pale glow of monitors, their eyes tracing the contours of DNA, fibers, and microscopic evidence that could connect the present suspect to the past crime. The partial profile, once a whisper, began to assert itself as a chorus of probability, each marker narrowing the field with precision and insistence. The cigarette butt, the upholstery fibers, the smudges on the car door, all began to speak a coherent language under the scrutiny of modern forensic methods. This was no longer just theory, the past was attempting to assert itself, piece by piece. The suspect remained outwardly composed, his life continuing in ordinary rhythms, utterly unaware of, or indifferent to, the meticulous reconstruction of his history. Morning routines, shopping patterns, coffee stops, and casual social interactions were catalogued and analyzed. Each seemingly mundane activity became a potential piece of the puzzle, mapped against timelines, witness statements, and behavioral patterns from decades earlier. The ordinary had become extraordinary, routine had transformed into surveillance fodder. Family members of the victim oscillated between hope and caution, years of anticipation tempered by decades of disappointment. Media coverage intensified, documenting every development, shaping public perception, and amplifying both expectation and anxiety. Headlines proclaimed progress, cold case reignited, DNA leads to arrest, community awaits justice. The family, however, absorbed each story with careful restraint, knowing that public narrative often simplifies what is far more complex behind the closed doors of investigation and courtroom procedure. Legal preparations surged forward, meticulous and calculated. Prosecutors fortified their case with cross-verified evidence, timelines, and corroborating witness statements. Defense teams challenged the methods, questioned chain of custody protocols, and scrutinized the partial DNA match, seeking every possible angle to introduce doubt. Motions and countermotions were filed in a rhythm dictated by both the law and the careful dance between probability and perception. The partial genetic match, once a fragment, now represented the fulcrum upon which the entire case teetered. Investigators revisited streets, neighborhoods, and abandoned lots where decades-old activity might yield new insights. Interviews were conducted with neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances, seeking details that could reinforce or refute existing hypotheses. Inconsistencies emerged, minor and major, adding nuance to the narrative but also introducing the ever-present specter of uncertainty. Every detail mattered: the angle of a streetlight, the pattern of parked cars, the sequence of fleeting conversations, and the movements of people who had long since forgotten their proximity to events now scrutinized intensely. The suspect's demeanor remained unnervingly calm throughout the process. He interacted with authorities within the bounds of legality but volunteered nothing. Investigators speculated, was this control, confidence, or detachment born of decades of invisibility? Theories proliferated, but certainty remained elusive. He did not panic. He did not make errors. He was, in every observable sense, ordinary, a fact that had allowed him to evade suspicion for years and now amplified the tension surrounding the case. Community response remained fractured. Some hailed the potential for closure as overdue justice, others questioned the legitimacy of relying on genealogical and probabilistic methods, wary of the ethical and practical implications. Social discourse expanded beyond the courtroom, with online forums, news commentary, and neighborhood discussions dissecting each development. The narrative became larger than the case itself, intertwining with cultural debates about justice, technology, and the limits of certainty. The partial DNA profile, combined with genealogical triangulation, now functioned as both roadmap and constraint. Analysts traced connections, mapped family trees, and constructed possible links to the suspect. Each new piece of information was scrutinized meticulously, cross-checked against historical records, and evaluated against known behaviors. The process was methodical, exhaustive, and relentless. Every assumption was challenged, every probability calculated, every margin of error considered. Even with progress, uncertainty lingered. No eyewitness testimony from 1996 could definitively place the suspect at the scene. The passage of time eroded recollections, and gaps in documentation left space for doubt. Investigators understood that evidence could only point toward the truth, it could never guarantee it. Every step toward resolution was mirrored by a corresponding need for caution, recognition that decades of silence cannot be erased simply by a single breakthrough. At night, offices remained alive with activity. Analysts and detectives worked under fluorescent lights, tracing every lead, revisiting every anomaly, and preparing for courtroom presentation. The cold case, once dormant, now pulsed with energy, filled with both promise and peril. Each observation, each new analytical insight, moved the investigation forward but also reminded everyone involved of the fragility of certainty. The past, though distant, was asserting itself with insistence. The streets of the city, once indifferent to her absence, now carried the echoes of her disappearance, each corner, each walkway, and each shadow a silent witness to events long past but not forgotten. Every detail, no matter how small, could tilt the balance between resolution and continued ambiguity. The cold case had transformed into an active investigation, alive with complexity, demanding precision, and haunting everyone who had been touched by its legacy. Even as preparations for trial advanced, the sense of uncertainty remained pervasive. Investigators, family members, and the community alike grappled with the tension between expectation and reality, knowing that decades of waiting had built anticipation into something almost unmanageable. The past pressed against the present, demanding acknowledgement, forcing a reckoning, and refusing to yield its secrets easily. The cold case, once silent, had begun to speak, but its voice remained incomplete, resonant with possibility, and heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. The city carried a quiet, almost imperceptible buzz as the trial approached, a tension that had been building unnoticed for decades now crystallizing into a palpable presence. Streets, sidewalks, and intersections that had once been ordinary were now charged with memory and expectation, each corner a silent witness to events long past. Detectives retraced paths, imagining the victim's final movements, hypothesizing about angles, shadows, and timing, reconstructing possibilities with meticulous care. Every detail, however mundane, a cracked sidewalk, a flickering streetlight, a distant barking dog, was re-examined, weighed, catalogued, and mapped against both historical records and modern evidence. The ordinary world had transformed into a stage for a narrative decades in the making, and everyone in proximity became unwitting participants in a drama they could not fully understand. In the lab, analysts continued their exhaustive work, tracing DNA markers with unwavering focus. Every sample, cigarette butts, upholstery fibers, smudges, was tested, retested, and verified. What was once a partial profile had been refined to a degree that could suggest identity, though uncertainty persisted. Probabilities were calculated, reassessed, and confirmed multiple times. Each step brought the investigation closer to clarity while simultaneously emphasizing the fragility of certainty. A single misstep could undo decades of work, and everyone involved understood the stakes with brutal clarity. The suspect remained outwardly calm, his life a continuous series of routines, each action scrutinized under the microscope of decades later investigation. Morning routines, work commutes, casual social interactions, all were observed, recorded, and analyzed. Nothing was left to chance. Yet he offered no indication of awareness, no sign that the shadows of 1996 had finally reached him. His composure was both unnerving and informative, a constant reminder of the ordinary surface beneath which extraordinary events had once occurred. Family members of the victim were caught in the oscillation between hope and caution. Each new revelation, each announcement of forensic progress, elicited a surge of anticipation tempered by decades of disappointment. The media amplified the tension, transforming every development into a headline: cold case nears resolution, DNA evidence points to suspect, community awaits justice. For the family, these reports were simultaneously validating and terrifying, reminders that the past was finally intersecting with the present in a way that could offer closure, or collapse under scrutiny. Legal preparations escalated, a meticulous choreography of strategy and caution. Prosecutors reinforced their positions, ensuring that every piece of evidence was corroborated and every timeline precisely reconstructed. Defense attorneys challenged the methodology, questioned the chain of custody, and scrutinized the partial DNA match, seeking to introduce doubt and delay. Every filing, every objection, every pre-trial motion was a calculated move in a high-stakes game that balanced the promise of resolution against the ever-present possibility of failure. Investigators revisited witnesses, neighbors, and former associates, seeking nuances that might reinforce or weaken the narrative constructed from decades-old evidence. Memory proved both ally and adversary, recollections contradicted one another, faded over time, or emerged in unexpected ways. Minor discrepancies, an offhand comment, a remembered vehicle, a streetlight angle, were analyzed for their significance, with investigators acutely aware that in cold cases, small details can pivot the direction of an entire investigation. The partial DNA profile, the cornerstone of modern forensic progress in this case, demanded careful interpretation. Analysts used genealogical triangulation to build probable family connections, mapping trees, examining migration patterns, and tracing relationships with painstaking precision. Each connection brought the investigation closer to the suspect but also carried inherent limitations. Probabilistic evidence required careful framing to withstand legal scrutiny and ethical considerations alike. The suspect's demeanor remained unchanged despite increasing scrutiny. He answered questions with neutrality, offered no volunteered information, and maintained a level of composure that heightened investigators' unease. Experts speculated that his behavior reflected careful calculation, patience honed over decades, and an understanding of the ordinary invisibility that had allowed him to avoid detection. This calm, almost imperceptible control became a psychological battleground, forcing investigators to read between the lines of everyday behavior for potential admissions. Community sentiment was complex and fractured. Some embraced the potential closure, celebrating the return of hope after decades. Others questioned the validity of modern forensic methods and the ethical implications of genealogical investigation, expressing skepticism that probabilistic connections could adequately substitute for direct observation or confession. Public discussion, amplified by media coverage and online discourse, transformed the cold case from a private tragedy into a collective social event, a tension-filled narrative that captivated attention far beyond the immediate circle of family and investigators. Within the courtroom, anticipation and anxiety coalesced. Analysts presented evidence with precise language, delineating what could be asserted and what remained uncertain. Probability and statistical confidence were dissected with rigorous care. Jurors absorbed this information, weighing the implications of decades-old events reconstructed through modern technology. Defense counsel emphasized the limitations, casting doubt on the certainty of conclusions drawn from partial data and probabilistic inference. Each word spoken, each motion filed, became part of a larger dance, negotiation between historical fact, forensic interpretation, and human perception. Even as the trial loomed, the cold case maintained a tension that transcended evidence and testimony. Streets, houses, and offices bore the intangible weight of decades-long anticipation. Memories, once dormant, resurfaced with varying fidelity, creating a dynamic interplay between past and present. Investigators, family members, and the community were all participants in a narrative that remained unresolved at its core. The events of 1996, the disappearance, and the long shadow of absence persisted, challenging anyone involved to reconcile hope, uncertainty, and the inexorable pressure of time. The investigation had transformed from a dormant file into an active, living pursuit of truth. Yet, despite the apparent breakthroughs, uncertainty lingered. The partial DNA match had shifted the investigation forward, but the ultimate resolution, legal, emotional, and communal, remained suspended, a testament to the complexity of human behavior, the persistence of memory, and the enduring impact of a single night in 1996. The cold case had awakened, and with it, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, poised between revelation and continued mystery. The streets felt different now, charged with the weight of decades-old absence and the anticipation of resolution. What had once been a quiet neighborhood, indifferent to tragedy, now thrummed with subtle tension. Every passerby, every passing car, every dog barking in the distance seemed caught in an invisible choreography dictated by events long past. Detectives returned to familiar corners, sidewalks, and intersections, replaying the night in their minds, imagining the victim's last movements with obsessive precision. Shadows, streetlights, and traffic patterns were re-examined, ordinary details were infused with extraordinary significance. The environment itself seemed complicit, as if the very city had witnessed what the human eye had missed. Inside the lab, analysts worked tirelessly, coaxing meaning from evidence decades old. Fibers, smudges, and the cigarette butt, once overlooked, now revealed a narrative under the scrutiny of advanced forensic techniques. Partial DNA profiles, refined over years, began to assert probabilistic certainty, narrowing the field of possible suspects. Each test, each verification, brought the past into sharper focus, yet uncertainty remained a constant companion. A single contaminant, a single error, could undo decades of painstaking work. Precision was not just a goal, it was survival. The suspect remained outwardly ordinary, his life a series of routines that appeared immune to scrutiny. Every movement, morning coffee stops, work commutes, casual conversations, was documented and analyzed, each action mapped against historical timelines, witness statements, and behavioral patterns. What was mundane became meaningful, what was overlooked became critical. Investigators recognized the danger in his ordinariness, the way it had allowed him to evade suspicion for decades, and how it now forced them to read the minutiae of daily life for clues that might connect him to a crime long past. Family members of the victim lived in a fragile oscillation between hope and fear. Every new revelation, every update on forensic progress, rekindled anticipation shadowed by years of disappointment. Media coverage amplified the tension, converting complex investigative steps into simplified headlines: cold case nears closure, DNA evidence points to suspect, community awaits justice. Each report was a double-edged sword, promising resolution while reminding the family that decades of absence could not be erased overnight. Their grief had aged into patience, yet hope remained a fragile, dangerous ember. Court preparations escalated with meticulous care. Prosecutors fortified their positions with corroborated evidence, timelines, and witness testimony, aware that any lapse could undermine decades of work. Defense attorneys scrutinized methods, challenged chain of custody procedures, and questioned the validity of genealogical DNA analysis. The partial profile, central to the case, became both a breakthrough and a potential vulnerability. Every legal maneuver was calculated, a delicate balance between asserting certainty and anticipating doubt. Investigators revisited interviews, re-examined witness statements, and retraced historical roots, searching for discrepancies that might support or undermine the narrative constructed from decades-old evidence. Memories proved both ally and adversary, recollections faded, contradicted one another, or emerged unexpectedly. Every minor detail, a comment, a streetlight's angle, a vehicle in the distance, was assessed for its potential significance, acknowledging that in cold cases, minutiae can pivot the trajectory of the investigation. The suspect's calm composure remained unnerving. He cooperated within legal boundaries but volunteered no information, revealing nothing of his own accord. Experts speculated on his psychological state, patient, calculated, aware of the invisibility that had allowed him to avoid detection for decades. His behavior created a subtle tension, forcing investigators to interpret ordinary actions as potential indicators of extraordinary culpability. Community sentiment was fractured and intense. Some embraced the potential for closure, while others questioned the ethics and reliability of modern genealogical and probabilistic methods. Online forums, news commentary, and social discourse dissected every development, amplifying both expectation and doubt. The narrative extended beyond the courtroom, becoming a collective exploration of justice, science, and memory. The partial DNA profile functioned as both guide and constraint. Analysts traced family trees, mapped connections, and evaluated probabilities with painstaking precision. Each link narrowed the field, yet the probabilistic nature of the evidence demanded careful framing in court and in the broader ethical context. The investigation relied on triangulating seemingly ordinary actions and connections into a coherent narrative capable of withstanding legal scrutiny. As trial approached, investigators, analysts, and attorneys navigated a complex interplay of certainty, doubt, and human memory. Streets, homes, and offices bore the weight of history, each corner steeped in residual tension. The cold case had shifted from a dormant file to a dynamic, living investigation, demanding precision, patience, and resilience. The past pressed insistently against the present, revealing itself in fragments, shadows, and probabilities, reminding all involved that the truth, though within reach, remained elusive and fraught with complexity. Even with progress, the shadow of uncertainty persisted. The partial DNA match advanced the investigation but did not guarantee resolution. Eyewitness testimony from 1996 remained scarce and unreliable, timelines had gaps, and memories continued to shift under scrutiny. Investigators understood that evidence could suggest, guide, and illuminate, but never fully replace, the messy, human reality of events. The cold case, long dormant, had awakened as an active force, alive with possibility and heavy with the unresolved weight of a night in 1996 that had forever changed lives and streets alike. The morning sun illuminated streets that had long forgotten fear but now seemed charged with it again, subtle and pervasive. Sidewalks, intersections, even vacant lots carried the memory of a disappearance that had haunted the city for decades. Detectives walked these familiar paths, retracing steps that no one had thought to revisit for years. Every shadow, every flickering streetlight, every ordinary detail was scrutinized for the faintest trace of evidence, the possibility that what was overlooked in 1996 might now reveal itself under the harsh light of modern investigation. The city seemed to pulse with expectation, a collective breath held for the resolution that decades had delayed. Inside the lab, analysis continued with relentless intensity. The partial DNA profile, refined over years, had achieved a level of specificity previously impossible. Fibers, smudges, and trace materials once considered inconsequential now spoke volumes when combined with genealogical triangulation. Each confirmation, each statistical calculation, brought the investigation closer to identifying the suspect while simultaneously amplifying the stakes. Analysts worked with methodical precision, aware that one misstep could unravel decades of painstaking labor. Every result was checked, double-checked, and cross-verified, a testament to the meticulous patience required to bridge the gap between past and present. The suspect's life remained outwardly ordinary, a pattern of daily routines and habitual movements that offered no overt clues. Morning coffee stops, work commutes, casual interactions, all were monitored, mapped, and analyzed. Investigators sought connections between these routines and historical events, hoping that the ordinary could intersect with the extraordinary in a way that revealed the truth. The suspect's calm and composed demeanor made him simultaneously inscrutable and suspicious, his very normality a potential weapon against discovery. Family members of the victim existed in a tense equilibrium of hope and guarded skepticism. Each breakthrough, each announcement of progress, brought elation shadowed by decades of disappointment. Media coverage amplified the emotional intensity, reducing complex scientific and investigative work into headlines: cold case nears breakthrough, DNA leads to arrest, community holds breath. For the family, these stories were both a source of comfort and a stark reminder of the long absence and the fragility of anticipated closure. Their grief had matured into a careful vigilance, balancing hope with a recognition of the uncertainties that still lingered. Court preparations intensified, meticulous in every detail. Prosecutors fortified their arguments, ensuring timelines, witness statements, and corroborating evidence aligned with modern forensic analysis. Defense attorneys scrutinized methods, challenged procedures, and questioned the reliability of genealogical DNA inference, seeking every opportunity to introduce doubt. The partial DNA match, the cornerstone of the investigation, became both a breakthrough and a focal point of vulnerability. Every filing, motion, and objection was calculated to influence the balance between certainty and ambiguity. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses, revisited crime scenes, and re-examined historical roots with obsessive care. Memory proved a double-edged sword, fragmented, distorted, yet occasionally precise enough to illuminate the truth. Minor discrepancies, a misremembered car, a fleeting conversation, or the angle of a streetlight, were weighed carefully against corroborating evidence, analyzed for significance, and logged into the growing matrix of facts, probabilities, and interpretations. The suspect's demeanor remained consistently controlled. He answered questions, complied with legal procedures, but volunteered no information. Experts speculated about his psychological state, considering patience, calculation, and an awareness of the invisibility that had shielded him for decades. His composure introduced a subtle tension, forcing investigators to interpret ordinary behavior as potential evidence of extraordinary culpability, each action scrutinized for hidden meaning. Community reaction was divided and intense. Some hailed the possibility of closure, celebrating the chance to reclaim a narrative long left unresolved. Others questioned the ethics, accuracy, and legitimacy of probabilistic DNA and genealogical methods. Online forums, news commentary, and public discussions dissected developments, amplifying both anticipation and skepticism. The cold case had become a public phenomenon, its narrative extending beyond the courtroom into homes, neighborhoods, and virtual spaces across the city. The partial DNA profile functioned as both roadmap and limitation. Analysts traced family trees, mapped probabilities, and examined historical patterns with painstaking attention. Each link narrowed the suspect pool but demanded careful framing for courtroom presentation and ethical consideration. Triangulating ordinary behaviors, historical records, and probabilistic evidence created a narrative capable of withstanding legal scrutiny while highlighting the uncertainty inherent in long-dormant investigations. As the trial loomed, tension escalated. Investigators, analysts, family members, and the community navigated a complex web of expectation, probability, and human memory. Streets, homes, and offices bore the weight of history, each corner steeped in residual tension from a night in 1996. The cold case had shifted from a dormant file into a dynamic, living investigation, demanding patience, precision, and careful interpretation. The past pressed insistently against the present, offering fragments of clarity but leaving the ultimate resolution uncertain. Even with breakthroughs, uncertainty remained pervasive. The partial DNA match advanced the investigation but could not guarantee conviction or closure. Eyewitness testimony was scarce, timelines contained gaps, and memories were unreliable. Investigators recognized that evidence could illuminate and guide but never fully reconstruct the complex web of human behavior. The cold case, long silent, had awakened as an active force, alive with potential and haunted by the unresolved weight of absence, reminding all who followed it that truth is never simple and justice, decades delayed, carries both promise and peril. The courtroom buzzed with a restrained intensity, a hum of anticipation that seemed to echo decades of unanswered questions. Jurors settled into their seats, aware that the evidence they were about to witness carried the weight of 28 years, convergence of time, science, and memory. Prosecutors laid out timelines with surgical precision, presenting witness statements, photographs, and modern forensic analyses as though assembling a machine designed to bridge the chasm of decades. Each piece of evidence was positioned carefully, measured, and contextualized, forming a narrative that traced the victim's last moments and the suspect's potential involvement with meticulous care. Defense attorneys countered with deliberate scrutiny, dissecting methods, questioning chain of custody protocols, and emphasizing the limitations inherent in partial DNA evidence. They highlighted the probabilistic nature of genealogical inference, probing the reliability of conclusions drawn from fragments and decades-old memories. Every assertion was challenged, every assumption interrogated. The trial became not just a recounting of events but a complex negotiation between certainty and doubt, science and interpretation, human memory and statistical inference. Analysts testified with calm authority, walking jurors through the nuances of DNA matches, marker probabilities, and familial connections. They explained how a partial profile could suggest identity but not guarantee it, detailing margins of error, confidence intervals, and the limitations of extrapolating conclusions across generations. Every chart, every diagram, every slide was meticulously prepared, designed to translate intricate scientific findings into understandable terms while maintaining the weight of their precision. The suspect remained composed throughout proceedings, an inscrutable presence whose ordinary demeanor contrasted sharply with the extraordinary attention focused upon him. His posture, expressions, and minimal reactions became part of the narrative itself, leaving jurors, investigators, and family members alike to interpret silence as either innocence, strategy, or subtle acknowledgement. This calm, so ordinary on the surface, became both shield and enigma, reinforcing the tension that had accompanied the case since the first traces of evidence re-emerged decades later. Family members observed with careful restraint, absorbing every detail, every testimony, every piece of visual evidence with a fragile hope tempered by years of disappointment. The courtroom became a crucible of emotion, where the weight of absence, grief, and expectation converged. Each witness statement, each analytical conclusion, carried the potential to provide relief, or to shatter the fragile optimism that had persisted across decades of waiting. Community attention remained intense, amplified by media coverage and social discourse. News reports and online commentary dissected every development, creating a parallel narrative that both reflected and influenced perceptions of the case. Public opinion oscillated between celebration of modern forensic breakthroughs and skepticism regarding the limitations of probabilistic evidence. The cold case, once a quiet mystery, had become a communal experience, a lens through which society examined justice, memory, and the evolving capacity of science to bridge temporal gaps. Investigators continued to provide context, testifying about the methods used to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence. They detailed the painstaking reconstruction of timelines, the re-interviewing of witnesses, and the triangulation of probabilistic evidence with historical records. Every decision, every methodological choice, was scrutinized for rigor, transparency, and adherence to scientific and legal standards. The trial became an examination not just of guilt or innocence, but of the integrity of investigative processes stretched across decades. The partial DNA match remained central, both a point of promise and vulnerability. Analysts carefully explained the statistical confidence, emphasizing what the evidence could indicate without overstating certainty. Defense counsel explored every nuance, raising hypothetical scenarios of contamination, secondary transfer, and coincidence. Jurors were left to navigate a landscape of probabilities and uncertainties, balancing expert testimony against human recollection, and scientific inference against decades-long absence of direct observation. Throughout, the past and present intertwined. Streets, homes, and neighborhoods that had once been mere backdrops now took on renewed significance, their ordinary structures imbued with layers of historical tension. Investigators, jurors, and family members alike grappled with the simultaneous presence of memory, evidence, and the inexorable passage of time. The cold case, once silent, had become a living narrative, unfolding under the scrutiny of law, science, and human perception. Even as proceedings continued, uncertainty remained. The partial DNA match, while compelling, could not reconstruct the entirety of a night that had left an indelible mark on lives and streets alike. Every witness, every expert, every piece of evidence contributed to an emerging picture, but gaps persisted. The investigation, now manifest in court, highlighted both the power and limits of modern science to illuminate the past, reminding all involved that truth is rarely absolute, and justice, even decades delayed, is a delicate balance of certainty, interpretation, and human judgment. The courtroom became a theater where time itself was on trial, where decades of waiting, investigation, and memory converged into a tense and fragile narrative. The cold case, once dormant, had transformed into an active, living inquiry, pressing relentlessly against the boundaries of human knowledge and experience. Its resolution remained uncertain, suspended between the power of forensic science, the limitations of memory, and the enduring weight of history that refused to be fully erased. The trial unfolded with a gravity that seemed to stretch time itself, each day layering tension upon tension, each testimony threading decades of absence into a fragile narrative. Jurors absorbed timelines, witness statements, and forensic analyses with careful attention, aware that the weight of history pressed upon them as much as the evidence itself. Prosecutors presented the case with relentless precision, connecting the partial DNA profile to the suspect with a meticulous logic that left no detail unexamined, yet the shadow of uncertainty lingered in every probability, every statistical nuance. Defense attorneys probed each connection, emphasizing the inherent limits of partial DNA evidence, questioning genealogical inference, and casting doubt on the reliability of human memory after decades. They highlighted gaps, contradictions, and hypothetical scenarios, underscoring that science could suggest but never guarantee absolute certainty. The courtroom became a tension-filled arena where law, science, and human perception collided, each argument reverberating through the history of the case and through the lives it had touched for decades. Analysts explained the methodologies behind the partial DNA match, walking jurors through the complex process of genealogical triangulation, probabilities, and marker comparisons. They described how decades-old evidence, once thought dormant, had been resurrected through modern technology, producing insights previously unattainable. Yet they remained careful, emphasizing the margins of error, the probabilistic nature of conclusions, and the ethical responsibilities inherent in interpreting genetic data. Each explanation layered precision over uncertainty, creating a delicate balance that the court was tasked to weigh. The suspect maintained a calm, unreadable presence throughout, his ordinary demeanor a stark contrast to the extraordinary scrutiny surrounding him. Every movement, expression, and response became part of the courtroom narrative, interpreted through the lens of suspicion and context. Experts speculated about his psychology, the patient, controlled behavior of someone who had evaded detection for decades, the invisibility that had shielded him, now tested in the harsh glare of forensic and legal scrutiny. His composure intensified the unease that had been a constant companion to investigators and family alike. Family members of the victim watched each session with a mix of fragile hope and guarded skepticism. Every piece of evidence, every expert explanation, every minor detail elicited a surge of anticipation, tempered by the long history of absence and uncertainty. Media coverage amplified the intensity, condensing complex scientific and investigative work into headlines that circulated through homes, neighborhoods, and social networks. Public discourse intertwined with courtroom proceedings, making the case a shared narrative of tension, curiosity, and moral contemplation. Investigators recounted the painstaking work of reconstructing events, re-interviewing witnesses, and cross-referencing historical records with modern forensic findings. They described the careful handling of decades-old evidence, the verification of every chain of custody, and the triangulation of seemingly ordinary behaviors and environmental details into a coherent picture. Their testimony underscored the rigor, patience, and meticulousness required to bridge the chasm of decades and translate fragmentary evidence into a narrative capable of withstanding legal scrutiny. The partial DNA match remained central, a linchpin connecting past and present while highlighting the probabilistic nature of scientific inference. Analysts walked jurors through confidence intervals, statistical probabilities, and the limitations of drawing conclusions from partial profiles. Defense counsel explored hypothetical alternatives, considering contamination, secondary transfer, and coincidences, ensuring that the court remained aware of the delicate balance between likelihood and certainty. The trial became not merely a question of guilt but a meditation on the reliability, limits, and ethical implications of forensic science in reconstructing historical events. Community response continued to ripple outward. Neighborhoods, online forums, and media outlets debated the case, amplifying both anticipation and skepticism. Public perception intertwined with the trial itself, demonstrating how unresolved crime resonates far beyond direct witnesses, embedding itself into social consciousness and collective memory. The cold case, once silent and dormant, had evolved into a societal event, a mirror reflecting concerns about justice, memory, and the intersection of science and morality. As proceedings advanced, the weight of decades became increasingly tangible. Every testimony, every visual aid, every argument carried the accumulated tension of years, the silence of decades, and the unresolved grief that had lingered since 1996. Streets, houses, and neighborhoods that had once been ordinary were now imbued with historical significance, each corner and shadow a witness to absence, anticipation, and human resilience. The cold case had transitioned from dormancy to full scrutiny, alive with complexity and fraught with moral, emotional, and scientific stakes. Even as evidence mounted, uncertainty persisted. The partial DNA profile, while compelling, could not capture the entirety of a night whose details had faded into memory and ambiguity. Witness accounts were fragmentary, timelines imperfect, and human recollection fallible. Investigators and jurors alike grappled with the tension between scientific interpretation and historical reality, recognizing that truth, delayed decades, is both illuminated and obscured by the passage of time. The cold case had awakened as a living, breathing inquiry, demanding patience, precision, and a confrontation with the enduring weight of absence. In the final hours of testimony, the courtroom felt suspended between past and present. The evidence, meticulously reconstructed, pressed against decades of unanswered questions. Every word spoken, every chart displayed, every expert explanation, was a step toward resolution, yet simultaneously a reminder of the fragility of certainty. The cold case, once silent, had become a force that refused to be ignored, a narrative that demanded acknowledgement, and a story whose echoes would linger long after the gavel fell, marking a city, a family, and a community forever changed by the night in 1996. The final days of the trial carried a weight that seemed to bend time itself, where each moment was layered with the resonance of decades. Jurors, investigators, family members, and the community collectively held their breath as closing arguments framed the case not just as a matter of guilt or innocence, but as a confrontation with the passage of time, memory, and the limits of human perception. Prosecutors emphasized the convergence of evidence, the partial DNA profile refined through modern science, corroborated timelines, and witness statements that, when pieced together, formed a pattern impossible to ignore. They spoke of persistence, of the decades of investigative labor, of the relentless pursuit of truth that had transformed fragments into a coherent narrative. Defense counsel countered with calculated precision, underscoring the uncertainties inherent in probabilistic evidence. They questioned whether decades-old memories could be trusted, whether statistical inference could definitively link a suspect to events long past, and whether the shadow of absence allowed too much room for assumption. They highlighted that the extraordinary ordinary, the suspect's calm, composed, everyday life, was as much a witness to invisibility as any forensic marker. Every argument was a careful dance between possibility and doubt, between science and the human capacity for error. Analysts returned to the stand to reinforce the integrity of the forensic process. They detailed the methods by which decades-old evidence had been preserved, extracted, and interpreted. They walked the jury through the process of genealogical triangulation, marker verification, and statistical confidence, emphasizing both the power and the limitations of the methods employed. The evidence spoke with a quiet insistence, but its voice was measured, acknowledging uncertainty while asserting its significance. The suspect sat through the proceedings with the same controlled demeanor that had defined him since the investigation had reopened. His composure, unnervingly ordinary, contrasted with the extraordinary scrutiny he faced, adding tension to every moment. Was it confidence, calculation, or simply the rhythm of decades spent unnoticed? Observers could not tell. His silence became a canvas upon which suspicion, speculation, and interpretation were projected, a mirror reflecting both the meticulousness of the investigation and the fragility of human judgment. Family members of the victim observed with a fragile mix of hope and apprehension. Each piece of evidence, every expert explanation, every subtle gesture of the suspect or witness triggered a complex interplay of emotion, anticipation, grief, relief, and fear. The courtroom became a crucible of human experience, where the accumulated weight of decades was distilled into moments of testimony and argument, every word resonating far beyond the immediate proceedings. Community attention, amplified by media coverage, remained intense. News outlets, online forums, and social networks dissected every nuance, generating narratives that paralleled the courtroom drama. Public perception became both observer and participant, amplifying anticipation, skepticism, and the moral questioning of justice delayed yet pursued with relentless rigor. The cold case had become a living story, bridging personal grief, communal memory, and societal reflection on the evolving nature of forensic science and the search for truth. As closing arguments concluded, the weight of the investigation, its meticulous reconstruction of a night-long past, settled over the courtroom. Investigators reflected on the decades of labor, the painstaking verification of evidence, and the reconstruction of timelines that spanned generations. Every fiber, smudge, and partial DNA marker had been examined, retested, and contextualized, each piece a fragment of a story demanding resolution. Yet even with this assembly of facts, the ultimate certainty remained beyond reach. The cold case had transformed from a dormant file into a dynamic, living narrative that intersected with law, science, memory, and human emotion. Streets, homes, and neighborhoods once indifferent to tragedy now bore the intangible weight of absence and anticipation. Every shadow, every corner, every familiar place was imbued with the presence of what had happened decades before, and what might finally be revealed. Even as the jury retired to deliberate, the tension remained suspended, a delicate balance between decades of uncertainty and the possibility of closure. The partial DNA match, the meticulous reconstruction, the expert testimony, all pointed toward revelation, yet the fragility of certainty remained. The past pressed insistently against the present, demanding acknowledgement, interpretation, and judgment. In those final hours, the echoes of 1996 lingered like shadows cast across the city, touching investigators, family, and community alike. The cold case, once silent, had awakened fully, a force that reshaped perception, demanded rigor, and challenged understanding. Whether the gavel would deliver closure, justice, or further ambiguity, the legacy of absence and the weight of decades remained undeniable. The story of that night, preserved in fragments and memories, had finally forced its way into the light, leaving a mark that would endure long after the court doors closed, a haunting testament to the passage of time, the persistence of truth, and the inescapable shadows of a vanished life.